Hi everyone, for a Filthy Lot Entertainment, welcome to Drawn and Cornered. It's the show that corners today's best comic book artists as they answer deep dive questions while they draw art suggested by you, the fans. After the show, you can bid on the art and all proceeds will go to our guest's charity of choice. So make sure you watch through to the end to see the final product. Today in the drawing chair is Jesse Lonergan. Jesse is an amazing artist that has created various self-published comics based on intimate stories and also including the graphic novel All-Star, as well as the incredibly layered webcomic Planet Paradise, which is going to be collected in a print edition by Image Comics in November of this year, to the astounding and mind-bending science fiction work on his latest book, Hedra, also from Image Comics. Jesse, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. We're big fans of your work here. Can you tell us what it is that you're going to draw for us today and what charity this is going to benefit?
I'm going to be drawing an outer space panda. And the charity is the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Amazing. I'm sure that is going to be an incredible piece. I want to start off with my first question today. On your website, it says that the first comic book you ever read was Asterix and the Great Crossing. Asterix and Obelix was an inspiration for a lot of creators of your generation. What was it specifically about that book and these characters that hooked you?
It was like the only comic I had like as a kid. So I don't know if it was like beating out other comics in any way because it was just the one that I had. But I mean, what I like about it is like kind of just like the sense of humor of it. Like it's kind of very slapsticky and it's got this very like polished sort of art, like this looks almost like the Smurfs, you know, but it's not the Smurfs. I grew up in Saudi Arabia until I was 5. So that's why I think I had Asterix, because I also feel Asterix for kids here is kind of nothing as well. So I was just, it's sort of like this book I got, I don't even know where, but overseas.
Oh, that's awesome. We're going to definitely get more into that a little bit later. But my next question is, I generally hate asking people about their influences, but your work is so unique that I have to. And aside from obvious influences like Mabius and Chris Ware, what else really got you into comics?
I mean, I think in terms of like getting me like into drawing comics, or things I looked at as like a little kid, Calvin and Hobbes was a big one. And then I think sort of like what got me into like comic book shops was probably like Image Comics and like Spawn and Savage Dragon. And those, it was sort of like, I feel like I had this idea of what comics were, which was very much like the John Buscema or Buscema, I don't know how to pronounce his name, or Jack Kirby sort of look. And there's not that I didn't like that, but it was just like I felt like I understood that. And then I saw like Spawn and I was like, I've never seen anything like this. And so I think those were the books that got me into doing comics like initially. And then it sort of like broadened and expanded from there.
I had to beg my mom to buy me a copy of Spawn when I saw it on the supermarket shelf. We were in the supermarket and it was on a spinner rack. I'm like, you have to buy this for me.
Yeah, and she would do it. My mom was unconvincible. Like it was like, if you don't have the money, you don't get it. So
you know, as you said before, you were raised in Saudi Arabia, but also in Vermont.
Yes, Saudi Arabia and Vermont.
How much, that's such a crazy contrast. How much time did you spend in each place and how did that impact the art that you were exposed to?
I was in Saudi Arabia, basically, I was born in California, but I think I was in Saudi Arabia when I was like 6 weeks old. My parents had been living overseas basically since like the mid 60s. And so I grew up in Saudi Arabia until I was about 5. And so then I moved to Vermont and I lived in Vermont basically until I went to college. So from, I don't know how, 13, 14 years. In terms of like affecting my art, I feel like anything that happened when I was 5, I don't really have much of an understanding about how it affected me.
That's fair.
But I think like possibly one of the things with like growing up in Vermont, and I also grew up in like very rural Vermont. So like my hometown was about like 1,000 people. So like we're talking like a small town, and I'm also like an only child. So like spending a lot of time at my own, like in a room by myself, just doing my own thing, is kind of something that's been like a part of my life, and sort of like with drawing comics as well, it's kind of a continuation of that. So maybe influenced in that way. I don't know really how else so much.
Were comics like regularly accessible to you? I mean, you mentioned that, you know, it was hard for your parents to buy you a comic book.
I don't think it wasn't that hard. It was more that my mom like refused.
Right.
I think, you know, it's sort of like the way comic books are. You don't really see them unless you like hunt them down. You know, and now it's even worse. Like you mentioned Spawn in a grocery store, but I don't think you can find anything in a grocery store. Maybe an Archie Digest or something.
Yeah.
But so like comic books were kind of like this invisible like thing, and then like you had to find out like where the comic book shop was. And for me, the comic shop was Comics Outpost in Barre, Vermont, which was about like 25 miles away from my house. And like it was also like, you know, sort of pre-Google or anything like that. So my friend Scott had to tell me, like, write down directions for how to get to this place, because it's not on Main Street or anything like that.
Right.
You know, and then sort of like walking into this world and finding comics in high school, basically. Yeah, so like they were a little hard to get to. Well, things like Calvin and Hobbes and like newspaper comic strips like Bloom County or Doonesbury, those were easily found.
Now you also mentioned that you spent in previous interviews you've mentioned that you spent 2 years in Turkmenistan with the Peace Corps,
right?
In the mid 2000s. What was that like? It must have been pretty harrowing.
No, definitely not harrowing. I feel like it was kind of like an adventure in some aspects. Like Turkmenistan's a very interesting place. You know, it's like a post-Soviet republic, and you know, it's kind of, things have sort of steadily gotten worse. It's also got a dictatorship with like really like kind of like all controlling dictators, but also like kind of weird dictators who do things like enter car races and of course win.
Doesn't the dictator of Turkmenistan have this weird obsession with show horses?
I mean, horses were a big thing in Turkmenistan. Like I forget the name of the breed of horse, but there is like a specific Turkmen breed of horse that they're very proud of. So that's like a thing. And you know, it was, so there's this dictatorship, and like for people there it's very bad, but I'm kind of like a little immune because I'm from the United States. I'm working with a US government. Turkmenistan doesn't want to have a problem with the US government. So It was more like, you know, like for about a year, it was sort of like an adventure of like, get in like a taxi and you'd have no idea where you're going and you barely speak the language. And hopefully everything would work out. And then I would say the second year was more kind of like boring because it had kind of become like normal.
Now when you go to these places, you know, like whether you're visiting or you're working there for a time, wherever it may be around the globe, do you ever try to hunt down and find what local comics are like in those places? I don't even know if Turkmenistan has a comic book scene at all. I doubt it. But.
I mean, I suppose it's possible, but really like there was no like sort of art scene to speak of. Like there's no like sort of like poetry or writing scene. I mean, while I was there, the number one book was like the dictator's book,
Right.
you know, and sort of stuff like that. So, and like the means of production didn't really exist outside of like the government, and I don't think the government would have much interest in producing comics and people with individual voices.
And speaking of individual voices, you wrote a book about the experience, Joe and Azat. And were you thinking that? Were you thinking that while you were with the Peace Corps, or did it come afterwards as a means of processing your time there?
Yeah, it definitely came afterwards, and it was sort of I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's like I was into indie comics, and indie comics, you sort of write what you know, and I had just like experienced this place, and so it felt like the book to write at that time, you know. And I don't know if that's actually a good motivation to do something, but that's sort of how I feel about the motivation of the book.
I think that's it's good enough a motivation as any.
Yeah, I mean, it was something where like I guess like I didn't want it to be like, I guess like with that book, and this is going to get weird and inside my like uptight brain, but like
let's get weird.
I not that weird, but it's like I think this is a very interesting place, and there are a lot of very interesting experiences in there. But I don't think I'm that interesting a person. But because it's like a foreign country and a different world, a character that like at least like me needs to be there, because something needs to say like, hey, I'm an outsider. All of my perspective on this is the perspective of an outsider. And so like I feel there's this sort of like conflict between it of like, there's this main character who really shouldn't be the main character, but it has to be for it to work. So like, I don't know. I don't know how like you can, do you know what I'm saying? Like this idea of like, you need to be telling people this is what I saw, but you also need that I saw this and I'm not a part of this situation.
Yeah, it's like it's like creating something. It's like the story and the location might be in a place that's unrelatable to some people, but you have to create a character that's relatable that brings you into it, right?
Yeah. Well, also just like, I feel like it's important for, I think the story of someone who's grown up in a place is very different from a person who's visited a place for 2 years. And so like, if I were to go to New York for 2 weeks and be like, I'm going to write, or Vancouver, if I were to go to Vancouver for 2 weeks and be like, I'm going to write a book about Vancouver, I need to make it clear that I visited Vancouver for 2 weeks. And I did not grow up in Vancouver. I wasn't born there or anything like that. And so I feel that creates like a narrative complexity that I don't know how rich a complexity it is. It's more, or if it's just a kink,
right,
sort of thing.
Now your book All Star is about a high school baseball player. Was baseball a big part of your life growing up?
I didn't play baseball. I mean, I played baseball as like a little kid, but I think I'd stopped playing baseball by like 6th grade or something. And so like, I was definitely a big Red Sox fan, being from New England, and like, my dad was a Red Sox fan his entire life. But I guess like with All Star, I kind of wanted to do this idea of like a sort of a high school superstar, where there's this feeling of a future for this person, and baseball really seemed like the most plausible of that. So I didn't play baseball in high school. I played basketball in high school, because, as I said, I'm from a very small town and I'm kind of tall. And if you're from a very small town and you're kind of tall, you play basketball,
right?
Kind of regardless on how good you are at it. But yeah, so is sort of trying to get at that sort of idea, and baseball felt like the way to go.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, sports and comics seem a little antithetical, but I'm seeing more and more of it these days. How did you go about translating a sport like baseball into comics, and what were the aspects of it that you wanted to capture to make it feel authentic?
I mean, I guess what I wanted to do was really sort of be able to capture sort of the movement of baseball within comics, and kind of like this kind of energy that exists in sports. And so like one of like my goals sort of working on that one was really like getting it so that like it feels like it has a lot of energy to it, but like, yeah, it's interesting when you say like sports and comics are antithetical, because I really learned that when All Star came out. It's just like, well, I would just be at like a convention, and just there are people like, I hate sports, I hated gym class, like all of this sort of stuff, and I was like, oh, really? Was it that bad? And maybe it was that bad. I don't know.
You're going to the wrong conventions. You should have gone to sports conventions to sell the book.
Yeah, but then I think the exact opposite would happen. They'd be like, oh, it's a comic. Like, who's interested in comics? Only like weird geeks.
You can't win them all.
Yeah. So, but it like that sort of like tension between the two wasn't something I really thought of, because I actually think in a lot of ways they're like, the fandom in some senses is very similar. Like with comic book fandom, like people know all of this knowledge about comic book characters and issue numbers and when things happened and all of this sort of stuff. And like baseball, it's like batting averages and statistics and whether they can hit a curveball and like, same sort of like geekery. It's just
right,
focused differently. So
gotta hone in on the gotta hone in on the statistic nerds.
Yeah, make it real inside baseball comic book.
Yeah. Now, a lot of your earlier work you seem to draw from real life experience, but your latest release, Hedra, is a heady, surreal sci-fi story that still has a personal feeling to it, but it feels like quite the departure. Was this a conscious choice to move away from more overtly personal stories?
Maybe. I don't know how conscious it was. But like after All Star, so All Star took like, I don't know, over 2 years to do, and writing it and drawing it, and it's like this real story set in like a real environment, and it's just like there's so much sort of rigidity that comes with that, like it's like weird stuff doesn't happen. Like everything sort of needs to be like kind of plausible looking, and sort of like after like working on that like kind of intensely for 2 years, I was just like, I just need to do something else. That's like a little bit like, like a little bit weirder, a little bit like more experimental, where I feel like I can kind of do whatever I want, because when I think about like, I think in my head, I had this idea of like indie comics are like this, and they're sort of reality based, they're kind of grounded. But I think personally, I had kind of moved past that and just being like, comics are just whatever I feel like making. And so like Hedra really came out of like that sort of idea of just like, what do I want to draw? How do I want to draw it? And go from there.
Now, Hedra is making waves in the mainstream comic world right now. But before it was released by Image, it was something you self-published on newsprint. How did it go from that stage to Image?
I tweeted a sale about it on last Black Friday, saying like it was 40% off. And I guess it got seen and retweeted by the right people, and Eric Stevenson at Image ended up seeing a copy and asked me I wanted to do like a mass market version of it. So
That must
I
have been
don't.
exciting.
Yeah, it was. It was kind of like a shocking email to get, because I had like submitted it to some publishers. Um, None of them had seemed interested, and an image in my mind was like, I don't know if this is really an image book, because it's pretty weird. But
Mm-hmm.
I was wrong, and it is an image book. So
Over the
um,
last several years, I've been astounded by the direction that a lot of independent publishers are going, especially like with the likes of Image and Boom. They're really pushing the boundaries and putting stuff out there that you wouldn't expect.
yeah, yeah. And so yeah, so it just sort of came together. Um,
Now, the book is quite vague by design, but there are clear themes of global destruction as well as rebuilding from the rubble. It's actually quite hopeful, at least in my reading of it.
mhm.
Are you the kind of storyteller who knows their themes going in, or do you just go with the flow and it just comes out how it comes out?
um, I think I have the idea of themes, but I'm also willing to like change things, and have things just go with where it seems to be going. And so like Hedra, I think originally was like a much smaller story, but then it felt like it was getting bigger, and
Mm-hmm.
getting more into like this kind of like metaphysical space god sort of stuff. So I just sort of was like, yeah, let's go with that. I if it doesn't feel creative, it feels very very boring.
Sure, yeah.
And sort of like I sort of I don't want actually to have a plan, like, or I don't want to feel like I have to do it this way.
That actually leads me to my next question. There's a lot of recurring images throughout the book, and it has a sort of semicircular narrative. And so, how important is structure to you?
Yeah, I guess it matters a bit. Like I feel I don't know. I kind of feel like whenever I think about these things, I'm like, yeah, it does and it doesn't. Like uh, with Hedra, I feel like it's going with a very sort of classical narrative structure of like, the hero departs, they go to an unknown world, they experience strange
Mhm.
things, they come back, which is kind of like a very classic structure. And it felt like with the kind of storytelling I was doing in Hedra, which is pretty like abstract, and like it's definitely different from most of the stuff you'll see on the shelves of a comic book store. And so it
Mhm.
felt like to do that kind of experimentation and do that kind of like abstract sort of storytelling, the story needed to be kind of like a simple story that people could hold on to reasonably easily, um, in order to allow for all that experimentation. So like
Sure.
I think about like structure in that sort of way. Like if I want to do something like this, how does the structure of the story work?
Mhm.
Um, but sometimes I think breaking those rules are good too. Um,
Absolutely. And I love the 35 panel grid. It's a wild format that you use in that book. And
yeah.
also in some of your other comics too. It allows you to break up the page and create flow in such interesting ways. Now, you didn't make things easy for yourself. What went into this decision?
I think part of it is I like squares. And so then it also comes against like what size square can you do on a page? How big of a page are you going to make? All of those sorts of pragmatic things. Um, and then also, I kind of I feel like giving yourself a grid is kind of a restriction, but that it allows you to play a lot, and sort of like it'll. I find whenever you create a restriction, not too many, but like if you create like one restriction, then it forces you to think a little bit differently and to experiment and try new things.
Mhm.
And so I felt like that kind of dense paneling allowed for that sort of thinking.
Was it intimidating to consider that much at once on every page?
Um, no, I mean, I, it is 35 panels, but like,
Mm-hmm.
like some pages are basically splash pages.
Mm-hmm.
They just have a lot of black squares on them. And so like not every panel is an active panel. There are some pages that are nearing 35 different panels. And those, I don't know that it's like intimidating. Like I don't think I ever really feel intimidated while drawing something because it's what I like to do. So I'm
Sure.
like, it's just like, oh, this is going to be dense. And like, I might look at something and be like, oh, this is going to be really annoying to draw. Or like, this is going to be really hard to ink. But I don't know that I'm like necessarily intimidated by it.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Now, one of the staples of your work is that it's got a lot of silence. Specifically, there's no dialogue in Hedra at all. And I think a lot of cartoonists sort of shy away from that because they worry about alienating their readers. But it can also be so affecting. What about having no text appeals to you? Is it simply the challenge of visual storytelling?
no, I don't actually think it's a challenge. I guess I feel, and I would say like this with most comics, I think there are too many words. Like, I don't think you really need that much. And it's sort of funny that like you use the word silence, and a lot of people have used the word silence, and I'm like, oh man, I am so in my own head because I think all comic books are silent, right?
Right. I guess so,
Right?
yeah.
There's no noise in comics, and so like I think a lot of times, like I think comics are sort of influenced by movies, which do have sound, and so you do have this sort of obligation to have people talking or something. But a lot of times in comics, especially with like something like Tintin, like when I look at Tintin now, I don't read the text. I skim it, because it's got these like huge blocks of text, and I don't necessarily find the text that compelling. So I just sort of like lean towards fewer words, I think, just in general. And I guess I have more of an artist sort of mind about it too, where I'm like, the art is the driving force for me. And like,
Sure.
words are great, and like they can be an effective tool, but if I don't need that tool, I'm not going to use it. And so, yeah, like, yeah, it's also just me being in my own head that I don't really think about it that much, because like I think All Star ends with maybe 20 pages with no dialogue.
Yeah.
And I hadn't even noticed, until somebody asked me about it. I was like, oh yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, no, I mean one of my favorite comic books growing up had no dialogue in it, and that was G.I. Joe issue 21, which is the dialogue-free Storm Shadow, issue.
Yeah.
Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes. It was pretty cool.
Snake Eyes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it can be just as effective. And like in some ways, I think like putting like words in Hedra would have actually felt sort of clumsy. Like it would, especially after like 15, 16, 20 pages, if someone's reading that and all of a sudden there's like a word, it's like, why? Why is this word here? Like it sort of feels like it's like cheating, but it's also like kind of clumsy at times. But sure. Like that being said, like Joe and Azad is incredibly wordy, and has lots and lots of text, because the kind of things, like when you're talking about like a political system, or you're talking about like how a marriage works, you really need words to explain those sorts of concepts. If you were to try and draw a concept as like freedom, like there's going to be a lot of drawings to get the concept of freedom in a way that makes sense narratively. And so like it's just like, for me, it's just when words are necessary, they're there, and when they're not, they're not.
Now the word Hedra is Greek, and it means face of a geometrical solid. Geometry plays a big role in the book, but what does that title specifically mean to you?
Um, so um, the while I was working on it, like the space gods that show up sort of towards the end. I was thinking like, how many should there
Spoilers
be?
for anyone that hasn't read it yet.
I don't think like Hedra. I feel like it's all in the telling.
Yeah.
It's you really just have to look at it. It's not really like if somebody says like, oh, the good guy wins, um, you know. But so there are these space gods, and sort of like how many should there be? How would they be represented? And I got into the idea of like the sort of platonic elements, which are earth,
Mm-hmm.
wind, fire, and water, and those. And then there's also the platonic solids with the polyhedra, which are basically gaming dice now,
Right. Yeah.
except for the 10-sided die, but like the 4, 6, 8, 12. And so I like the imagery of those for representing the gods. I like that, and I got really into like the platonic solids and like what is special about them, how they interact with each other, but then also that there's like a fifth platonic solid that Plato like wasn't sure about. He didn't know what it was. It wasn't earth. It wasn't wind. It wasn't fire. And so like those ideas were in the background of my mind while I was working on it, and I don't expect it to be understood while you're reading it, but I don't think it needs to be. But it's sort of like those ideas and sort of this kind of like elemental form. I like that idea of a title. I also like the idea of a title that, because of like the way the comic book works and there's no words, I kind of wanted the title to be something people wouldn't be sure about. So for example, if the title was Space, or like Adventure in Space, or like even if it was like Star Wars, like that would pull away from all this wordless art that's in it. And so like having a title that's a little unclear, it's a little unsure, maybe people don't know how to pronounce it. Like I liked that aspect. And like with Hedra, I also like that it's 5 letters. And the comic is 5 panels wide. And so like it can fit in there. And so it was just sort of like all of these ideas sort of coming together into the comic.
Absolutely. Now, I feel like now that Hedra is out, and by the work that you also post on Instagram, lots of people would think that you're a sci-fi artist, but that's not true at all based on your previous work. Do you worry about being put into a box?
Maybe. But like, I guess it's like people might think I'm a sci-fi artist, and that's fine. I like sci-fi, and I like drawing sci-fi stuff. I'm drawing an outer space panda, and I'm very happy doing it. So I guess so. I guess I do worry, like, I think Hedra is like a lot of people's probably first impression of me, because nobody knows me really. And so when like Planet Paradise comes out, and it's a very different story, it's a much sort of smaller story, a much quieter story. It's not as visually experimental, and it's got like, it's much more about character and sort of like these nuances in the relationship between the characters. And so if people are going into that book expecting Hedra, they might be disappointed. And so I guess I think about it. I don't know that I worry about it, because
Right.
I can just draw something different.
Sure. And speaking of something different, one book that we didn't really touch on is Flower and Fade. It's a far cry from Hedra, and it's almost like an anti-romance, but very much a slice of life sort of style, more in the tradition of Fantagraphics cartoonists. How does your process differ between more personal work and more narrative-driven stuff?
So I feel like that question makes it sound like Flower and Fade and Hedra were written close together. But I think there are at least 10 years in between those two. And so like, I don't know that like I could say like, well, if I'm writing something personal, I'll do it this way. It's just that like when I was that age and making comics, that was the type of story I wanted to tell, and that's the way I told the story. And now I'm a different age making comics, and I'm not particularly interested in writing another Flower and Fade. And so I'm going to like do comics the way I see fit now.
Do you still have the sort of desire to make more intimate stories, or do you just go from there to science fiction? Like is that where the progression is going right now? It's like I'm on the science fiction sort of like kick right now, so I'm just going to do more of that.
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily on like a science fiction kick. But I think like that idea of like sort of those personal stories, like those were something that really appealed to me 10 years ago. And now they don't really appeal to me that much. Probably because I'm like older and I'm like, I've got personal stories. We've all got our personal stories. I don't, it's like the same thing with like books. Like, like when I wrote Flower and Fade, like I would read like Jack Kerouac books and I'd read Dostoevsky and I'd be like, oh, this is so amazing. I feel it. I feel it so much. And I don't think I can read a Dostoevsky book now. Like if I were to try and sit down and read The Idiot, I'd be like, I'm past this. And so I don't think it necessarily, I don't think I'm necessarily like, oh, I'm only going to do sci-fi, but it's more just like, this is what interests me now. And maybe it's like surrealism, maybe it's sci-fi, maybe it's something else. And I don't mean to say like Jack Kerouac is for young people or anything like that. It's just like, I feel like you come across interests and tastes at certain points in your life, and then you're not interested in that anymore. And so like Lord of the Rings, like when I was a kid, I loved it and I read it super fast. And then I tried to read it when the movies came out, and no, I was just couldn't sit down and read it.
Now, one thing our co-producer on the show, Lonnie, talks about a lot is the language of comics and how it's something creators and readers need to kind of learn to speak. It's different from just words or images on their own. How aware are you of speaking the comics language when you're creating?
I think I'm pretty aware of it. Like it's really how I sort of like think about things. Like most of my ideas, right now, or for the last 5 or 6 years, they come from drawing, and they come from like putting panels together and like building off of those ideas. So it's like thinking in terms of comics first before anything else. And sort of like the way, like for a long time, I've actually fallen out of the practice now. I just had like, like little sketchbooks, and I would just have them with me, and I would just draw comics in them, no scripts or no plans. I just make them up as I go along, and sort of like, but always thinking of like panels and sequences and stories in that sort of sense and that sort of way of doing it. And so it's kind of just become like the way I think, which can be maybe detrimental, but like it is also that like I feel there's a lot of like comic book ideas, and like I don't know how to, like, I guess like when Hedra came out from Image, my worry was like it's going to be a little too inside comics. Like it's like it's going to be a little bit too much of a foreign language. But
were you surprised at the success of the book?
Yes and no. Like I think printing the newsprint edition, I'd like taken it to conventions, and I'd gotten like sort of a sense of how people responded to it. And also like there are some like kind of real good strengths to it as a book. And like with the newsprint edition, the first page was the cover, and the last page is the back cover. So just like a newspaper where it's like front page, back page, and like, but so when people look at it, they know whether they like it or they won't like it. Nobody who's looking for like a sword and sorcery, big boob adventure story is going to pick it up. Like, it just pushes them away. But anyone who's sort of interested is like, oh, I'm interested in this. And then they turn it and it just continues. And so like, I felt like it would either just be completely ignored or some people would like it. But it seems like it's been pretty positive. And yeah, so yeah, a little surprised.
All right. Now there's a quote on your website that really struck me. You said, "I want to master new techniques, different tools, and different ideas for narratives and stories." And that really comes through in your work. There's a desire to push the medium forward. How do you continue to challenge yourself in this way?
There's always like more, like I feel like with comics, there's so many different elements to comics. Like, there's like with Hedra, everybody talks about like the layouts and the paneling, and that's like one element of comics. But then there's also just like your ability to render, like how well can you draw something, and then there's like within that ability to render, there's like different styles. And so like people with me recently have been like, oh, Mobius or Jeff Darrow, which is sort of one style. But then there's also like Bruce Timm or like Darwin Cook, which is a super clean, beautiful, simplified style. And so like, there's always like a different aspect you can focus on. Like, most of the time I work with like ink, sort of black and white, but like maybe bringing in colored pencils. Like there's also, I don't know, I just feel there's like so many different elements that can be tweaked and played with. Like one of this idea for a comic that I've been like trying to start for a long time is sort of around this idea of, how people say that they prefer books to movies?
Sure.
Because when you read the book, your mind fills in the images and the details.
Yeah.
But I feel the reverse is also true with images. And that like, if you look at an image, a single image, your mind will often like fill in the story. And so I feel this especially with like 1970s and 1960s sci-fi book covers, that you look at these book covers and it's like, wow, this is the best book. I know it's going to be great. And then you pick it up and read the story, and the story actually like not as good as the cover. Not as,
it's usually garbage.
No, that's not fair. But like not as good as what I imagined the cover to be.
Sure.
Like the story that didn't have many details, but like I felt it in my head. Like I really like that story a lot, and then the book sort of took away from it by giving me too much. In the same way, like a movie in a way gives you too much. And so I really like the idea of telling like a story where it's even vaguer than Hedra, but like it's like these sort of like these single images, but it allows like the reader a lot of like creative input into what the story actually is. And so like, I have like those kinds of ideas in my head, and I feel like I could try that probably 5 or 6 times and not have it work. So like there's always, something that you can like push forward in and like attempt to get better at or attempt to do or something like that. Recently I was having to do some work with PowerPoint, and there's all the PowerPoint icons. Like, you just click on the icons and it's like pizza and like a gorilla or whatever. And I was like, oh, these are really fun. It would be really fun to just do a story that's entirely icons. Like where you have a main character, but the main character always looks exactly the same.
Right.
And it's just this iconographic story.
Well, I mean, if you do it, I'll read it.
Okay. It'll probably be a very quick read because it will be like just a bunch of icons.
Now, is your desire to make comics, is it purely to do the stuff that you want to do, or do you have any desire to do other people's stuff, like other characters, perhaps more mainstream stuff? Do you have a desire to say, do something for Marvel or DC or?
Yeah, not like a incredibly pressing desire.
Mhm.
Like, where it's like, oh, I gotta work on Batman or anything like that. But as a person who just like loves comics, the idea of doing like a monthly title for like 6 months, like I'm like, yeah,
Mhm.
that would be good to do.
Is
And
there is there a is there a character that if somebody came to you with, you'd have to say yes?
um, yeah, I think Batman and Spider-Man. I would have a hard time saying no. I don't think anyone will come to me with like flagship characters.
Hey, you never know.
Um, yeah, you never know. Deathlock is one of my
Oh,
favorites.
that's interesting.
So I would love to do a Deathlock book. Um, Shade the Changing Man or the Changing Girl. I feel would be like a lot of fun
Mhm.
visually, like a lot of good stuff to play with. Let's see what else. Silver Surfer would be one too.
Sure. Now I have one last question for you before we get to see what you've been working on this entire time. I wanted to ask you what else you have in the works. What can we expect in the future? Is there anything
Um,
that you can tell us about?
yeah, I mean, Planet Paradise is coming out from Image in November. I
Mhm.
forget the exact date, but that will be a graphic novel um, coming out. It's like 100 and I forget the exact page count, 120 something. So that'll be coming out in November. I did. It's going to be like this sort of like indie race car book that I did.
Oh,
I really haven't figured out a good way to describe it, but it's like all these racers, like one race. It's kind of like a wacky racers, but with all these like 1960s Formula One cars.
cool.
And that one's going to be like pretty small. Me and a friend is sort of doing it. It's going to be like risograph printed, so two colors, just like pink and
Oh,
blue, and
neat.
all the colors are created with that. Yeah, it should be a lot of fun, but I think it'll also be like kind of small because can't do that much risograph printing. Um, and I'm also working on a comic like on Patreon right now that eventually I'll start pursuing to get in print called Prime, which I think like stylistically is similar
Mhm.
to Hedra, but is sort of more of a like medieval, primordial sort of like not quite a creation story, but like an ancient epic type of story.
Jesse, thanks so much for being cornered with us today. Let's have a look at this art that you've created for us. Wow. Oh, that's amazing. If you want to own this magnificent piece, check out the auction link below in the description. All proceeds of the sale will benefit the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Now make sure to like, subscribe, and click that little bell icon to get notified for future episodes. Thanks for watching Drawn and Cornered, and Jesse, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.